Welcome to another episode of Beyond the Youth Room podcast. I am Keith, and this is
Ryan Cottle.
And we are talking about an important topic today on how to deal with the relationships between you and senior leadership. So the youth leader or the youth pastor and senior leadership, sometimes that relationship is not always in sync. And so we're going to talk about some of the ways that we can improve that relationship. So stay tuned. Now, if you're just now joining us and you haven't seen our content before, thank you so much for tuning in. We exist so that we can really encourage youth leaders to do what our podcast is titled, Go Beyond the Youth Room. So we want to encourage you towards gospel advancing ministry. We are no perfectionist experts at all. We're just practitioners. We're both youth pastors in the Northern Virginia area. And our goal is just to share some of our best practices so that maybe in turn the Lord would use that to impact you and your youth ministry. We also have training available for students. So the podcast is sponsored by Edge Club. And if you go to edgeclub.org/training, you can take a look at our online training that's trained student missionaries to reach their public schools for Christ. So if that interests you, we've both used that as a kind of strategy for outreach and our youth ministries. And we invite you to do the same. So you can take a look at that at edgeclub.org/training. Now, in this episode, as I mentioned, we are going to get into what we see a lot of people asking questions about, like in some of the Facebook groups that we're part of, around youth ministry, where they're conflict, or there's maybe a philosophy difference, or there's just some really differing things when it comes to senior leadership at your church. So that includes maybe your senior pastor, or depending on your church governance style, your elder board, people that kind of help lead church. Sometimes there's an unhealthy balance of certain families that are, politically in charge of the church. The
families of the church, yeah.
Yeah, and so we're going to talk about the ins and outs of that today, and how we can approach that from godly attitude. And how does this have to do with going beyond how does it have to do with evangelism? And I think the reason why some of this comes up is, one, it can distract us, right? It can distract us from the mission that we have at hand. But also it can be a deterrent if you're not synced in with people, like you don't have the support that you need to really to accomplish the mission that God's given you to make disciples who make disciples when it comes to teenagers. So Ryan, you have a unique situation that's not as common, because a lot of people are either volunteering or they're hired by a church to lead a youth ministry program. And you have been hired by your church, but you grew up in the same church, and your dad is on the elder board, and so your family are very involved with the youth ministry. So you have a great representation there. So tell us a little about your experience, and then we're going to say how you have no idea what it's like to have any conflict with your senior leadership.
Never. Just
kidding. No, but share a little bit about your experience at your church now.
Yeah, so we are true multi-voice. So we have lay elders and paid elders, but all of them are elders, pastors. We use those words interchangeably. They all speak from the pulpit. They share the pulpit, but they each kind of have oversight over different ministries and areas, and then they work together as an elder board in order to really shepherd the vision that God gives them for our church. And so not only is my dad on the elder board, my dad is the elder over student ministry. And so
he served as the youth pastor there for a
while.
He kind of led the youth ministry.
So that's actually how it all kind of came about. I wasn't thinking of going into ministry, and my dad was just talking with our paid elder who had come on board, and the paid elder, my boss now, was the one who was like, well, I'd love to talk to him about like student ministry and like possibly coming on board. And, my dad was like, well, I'm having no part of that. Like I'm stepping out of that. And so the whole onboarding and interview process, my dad was not a part of that because he wanted to be clear. But the nice part is I'd grown up with my dad, like being my coach. And so we kind of already knew how to draw that line between like when we step on the field, like you're not my son, like you're a player just like everybody else. And my dad was always really good at that. So yeah, when I came on board, there were some people who were like, oh, sure, like your son. Yeah. But I think the thing that people don't understand is like, not that it needs to be a succession, right? Like we don't want that. We don't want, okay, well, your family, so like you're going to be the pastor, right? But don't you want like your pastors raising like solid kids who can then go into ministry?
Yeah,
And I think we discount that so much. So, yeah, for us, it's actually pretty seamless. I mean, my parents volunteer in student ministry on a weekly basis. And so while my dad has oversight and is my senior leadership, when it comes to being on staff, my boss oversees the staff. So I kind of have two really godly men who can shepherd me. And the relationship literally that we have, and my pastor told me this, he's like, I'm going to give you a lot of leash. He's like, you have all the leash you want. He said, but you're also going to have enough leash to hang yourself. He's like, so you need to be careful. And so, but it's true. I mean, like they go make disciples. But if it comes to a point where we got to rein you in, like we're going to rein you in.
Yeah.
And we're giving you enough leash to where, yeah, you can really mess this up. So just so you know, like we're going to have oversight, but we're not going to micromanage. So for us, it works really well. And I've really enjoyed it. There's never been once where I've been like, this is so annoying, like having, now sometimes can it be hard because my dad and I see things the same way? Yeah. And I need to be careful of that. But that's where it's nice having, other elders to kind of be sounding boards too. Yeah. So for us, it's really simple. And it makes it work. But yeah, I don't understand what it's like, to have somebody who you don't see at the dinner table, pretty often, as also your senior leadership. So I am interested to hear what it's like for all the other people out there who aren't in my situation, because I don't, that's all I've really known.
Yeah. Well, I'll share a brief experience that I had. So when I was in college, I was studying to be youth ministry, being in youth ministry. So I was a youth ministry major, and part of that is like, I want to get some hands-on experience, like actually leading youth ministry. And so I applied for this. I was a part-time youth pastor position, if there is such a thing. And met with, it was just a really small church in South Carolina. And so I go to meet with the senior pastor the first day on the job. So I got hired in this role, go to meet with the senior pastor, which I didn't know very well. Like I just, we kind of, like I had sat in one of the services before, seen him preach and stuff. And so this is like our first like official meeting. And so he's like, this is your first day, and I need to be frank with you. I need to share something with you. And I was like, at this point, like, I'm like, I don't even know what to expect here. And he said, I've been sleeping with the church secretary. And there was like this long pause, like silence. And he goes, she's also my wife though. and that kind of broke the ground of like a humorous relationship that I had with senior leadership at the time. So back then it was a congregational style, church that, we voted like on everything. And so there was, so he had my back and stuff. And we understand the same kind of humor. And, but it was definitely a terrifying, like maybe
you were like,
this is, and I was like, what did I just get myself into?
Please say, just kidding.
Yeah. And so when it comes to some of the stuff, like, of course, like, there's moral issues that are in an extremely high level of priority. If you're having disagreements with senior leadership over moral issues, then yes, like that is something that needs to be addressed like immediately. And also, that's grounds for like, okay, you need to leave the church. It's not being handled. Okay. So I was thinking like, what did I just get myself into? Like, what am I? And so it turns out that his wife was on staff, in a very part-time role.
Yeah, you probably, good thing you verified that.
Yeah. And, but when it comes to, disagreements, a lot of times the conflict is not over moral issues, which I think would prioritize. So that's not what we're really here to address, because some of those things will be a lot more obvious to disagree on if sin is not being addressed in senior leadership, or if they're being complacent about addressing sin in the church. That's I think a different category. But oftentimes we see it as maybe a disagreement on philosophy, or even just like preference. And so I think that's where we as the youth leader need to kind of discern, to really not make a mountain out of a molehill, so to speak, of really trying to understand. So I would say, if there's, and oftentimes we know this too, that like we take things personally, right? So if there's criticism about the youth ministry that we have been leading, we're going to take it personally because we've invested a lot of time and effort and blood, sweat, and tears into that youth ministry. So of course, when someone makes a comment, or if there's a questioning, about something that we did, then it's definitely a hard thing. So I would say the mature response though to a differing opinion or differing preference or philosophy is to, one, ask yourself if you can point to a verse or scripture that like is really the issue. So in other words, is there a sense? Because we often use words like this is right or wrong when there's no real moral issue when it comes to what we're disagreeing about. And so with that, be sure in the things that your, philosophy would be part of, so obviously we want to have like the same kind of mission vision of the church, like overarching, if it fits under the umbrella of the mission and vision of the church, the direction of the church. But yeah, I would just say tread lightly when it comes to taking things to another elevated level of a moral issue when it's just a preference or it's just a philosophy issue. And I see that a lot. So now you've seen people comment on different conflicts that they're having with senior leadership.
Yeah.
What are some things that people bring up frequently, and how can we maybe talk about that and address those?
Yeah, that's why I love like the youth pastor Facebook group. So if you're not a part of one, join one. There's a lot of variances of congregations and thoughts, but you can get a lot of ideas of like, okay, I'm not the only one. So yeah, one of the biggest things I see is how do you deal with a senior leadership maybe that doesn't respect your time or your boundaries, or maybe also somebody who maybe has expectations that we feel are unrealistic.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I would be interested to hear how you would, what your advice, because you've been in this a lot longer than I have, and you've also been in multiple ministry settings. So I have thoughts, but I don't think I've quite been able to filter them as much. Not that I really filter any of my thoughts. I just kind of say what comes to mind. But yeah, I mean, how would you say to somebody who's like, hey, they don't respect my boundaries. They don't feel like they don't respect me, but yet they feel called. We know it's really hard because when you're working with kids, you know what I mean? It's almost like you have the church, but you also kind of have like the youth group. And as much as we want to be a part of the church, sometimes it's really easy to get along with the kids and invest in them, but struggle with that back end. So what would your advice be to somebody who says like, they don't respect me or my boundaries?
Yeah. So I think effective ministry happens when three things are happening. So you have expectations, accountability, and relational involvement. And so I think when one or more of those are not happening, that's where conflict can arise. So, and that's applicable to, both up and down. So in other words, like we can have that, that senior leadership, if they're not providing the expectations of what they're trying, they're actually expecting you, but then they hold you accountable to something that you didn't even know was the expectation. Well, then, yeah, it feels like they're a dictator, or they're like, involved themselves in your personal space, or, not setting proper boundaries because they may not have properly outlined it. Now, if you have been shown the expectation and you're not meeting those expectations, but they're holding you accountable to them, then okay, like whose fault is that? If you agreed to, okay, this is the expectation, like, this is the weekly responsibilities, and so I think oftentimes in that case, usually that's like a sign, like the flag goes up of there's not clear expectations. And so I would say no matter what, like the underlying principle for this whole conversation, this whole episode is communication, like almost overly communicating expectations, overly communicating. So like, for instance, something happens, there's a conflict in our ministry. The first person that I talk to is my boss, so my location pastor where I am, because I don't want him to be blindsided if that person goes around and talks to him or addresses it, because then he's like caught off guard. He doesn't know the whole situation or the whole story. And so we're overly communicating. And there's even times where like I'm calling him, different outside of the hours of, normal time, whatever, just say, hey, like this, this is a developing situation, or even if it's just congregational care stuff. So in other words, like we have a student that, that's going through a really tough time, and they've attempted suicide. I just wanted you to be aware in case the family reaches out to you too. And so all that stuff is, I would say, overly communicate. But those three things, the expectation, accountability, and relational involvement, I think if those three things are firing on all cylinders, you're going to have a successful relationship with your senior leadership, but also you can use that to invest in your adult leaders, student leaders in your youth ministry as well. So when you have expectations and you have accountability, but no relational involvement, it seems cold. The environment seems cold, where they're not checking in on you. The only things they ask you about are your work-related tasks. And you're like, hey, I'm a person too, so like you want to be cautious of that. The other thing, if you have expectations, relational involvement, but no accountability, then you're not really, hitting those goals or markers that like they're not managing you well in the sense of like helping you to do that. So I would guess that the majority of youth leaders are probably not being checked in on, or, being like intentionally cared for. Like in other words, if we're going to err on that side, on one side, I think it's going to be like they have more freedom. They have more, or, less accountability, like to live out those goals and expectations. And so that could be a conversation that you have with your senior leadership of saying, hey, I need these things. Like, I need you to check in on these things, or I need you to, set the expectations so that I know what to hit. And if someone says that they're upset with you, but they can't exactly point why, then that's like impossible. It's like, well, what would you want from me? Like, what are the expectations? And then I can try to meet them. If they can't answer that, that's a moving target, right? We don't, if they're just like, well, you're just not doing a great job, or you're not doing, and so with that, I think overly communicating, and even asking for expectations. I always say this too, like, because I think youth leaders are pulled in so many different directions, if they're on staff at church or if they're leading in a volunteer role. They also have stuff outside of that too. Like, so if they're volunteering, sometimes they're working another job, they're, caring for their own family. And so when it comes to clearly defining that role, ask for a job description and then hold them to it. Like, in other words, like, say, hey, this is what we agreed to, to do, what you're asking me to do, or what you're, because if you're saying that, these are outside of you're invading my personal boundaries, are they literally asking you to do something outside of that? And then if so, just, point back to that to say, hey, this is what was in my job description. If there's something that we need to add to it or adjust, then like, let's talk about that. But, this is something that'd be outside the realm of, and so I think you want to have a heart of servant, but also like, clearly define your role and set clear boundaries. So, yeah.
Well, and I think too, we mistake authority with influence. And I think we kind of view like, well, they have the authority, therefore they have they hold all the cards, but that's not really how, relationships work. It's not a mandated that can only go so far. It's really about influence. And so I would want to encourage somebody who is thinking, well, they're looking at senior leadership going, I'm just frustrated, or this isn't, everybody sees this as a problem and things like that. Well, don't just be like, well, they have authority, they make the decisions, we just all sit here and, complain. Not that I'm saying that's what you're doing, but you realize you have influence. Like, you have influence to try and better the situation, to maybe repair that relationship, be the one who kind of can break, the ice in terms of helping, this begin to work and for them to maybe see some of these things. So what would your advice be to, youth pastor, student ministry director, full-time, part-time, whatever the church circumstance is? What are some things that they can do that can really help their pastor? What are some things that you can do that can kind of set your pastor up for success when it comes to youth ministry, but also just in general?
Yeah. So one of the things early on in my experience in youth, as a youth leader was to always have like a 30-second highlight, of what's going on in youth ministry. So in other words, like, I would be ready to share that on the drop of a hat, like as a positive thing that's happening. If there is no positive thing that's happening,
you just skipped it that way.
Yeah, maybe you should, really, like, in other words, like, are you really focused on like impact rather than just like activity? And so in other words, and sometimes it's literally just sitting down and thinking like, oh, what did happen this past week? Oh yeah, like someone came up to me and said, hey, I shared the gospel with this Mormon guy that came to my front door, and I, and that's the first gospel conversation. It's like, well, I'm going to share that story, with senior leadership as an encouragement, like to kind of share that celebration of what's happening in the ministry. So I would say always be ready with an impact story. And that can be, a 30-second to 5-minute, version of it or whatever. And so, even like if someone in passing, like if we have a parent, it's like, hey, like, I'm praying for your ministry. It's like, oh, thank you so much. Like, just this past week we had this, and we would share that, impact story. And so just to highlight things to where you're not just going to them to ask for things, you're not just going, when you're in trouble or when, but like to kind of share in the celebration of what's happening in these ministries, so they can see like, wow, it's not just holes in the wall and smelly teenagers after, after youth group night. And so when it comes to, just encouraging that relationship is, just sharing stuff that's happening, to help them see, and then share prayer requests too. It's like, hey, pray for so-and-so because this is what they're up against right now. Like, cause I think sometimes senior leadership, if they're not involved in youth ministry or if they haven't been involved, they think, they think of youth ministry sometimes as glorified babysitting, right? Like where they're just like, well, you're just watching the teenagers, you're teaching a Bible lesson, whatever, but they're not really seeing like the real issues that we're dealing with, that we're helping disciple students through. And whether it's like identity stuff or gender stuff or, sexual things or, all these different things that we can, the life issues that they're going through. So share those things so that they can see how the brevity of what they're going through, but also the highlights of what's happening.
Yeah. I think, it depends on your leadership, right? Like how hands-on they are or how hands-off they are. You know, my boss, he's really just like, just go get it done. Like, I trust you. Like, you wouldn't be here if I didn't trust you. So go. And so he's not going to be that guy who pulls me into his office to say like, hey, how are you doing? So I've just learned, I just go in there, and he's fine with it. Like, he loves, you know, sitting down and talking, but he never wants me to feel like I'm, you know, that he is micromanaging me or overseeing me and things like that. So I just go in there and I just, hey, you know, I just want to share a win with you or things like that. So I think it depends, on your pastor kind of getting a feel for that, but also understanding the weight that they carry. You know, the weight that they we work with teens, we work with parents. Imagine they're going to give an account for that, even if they've never met that kid or never been to youth group. Like, they're still going to stand before God and give an account for everything that goes on in the church.
Yeah.
And so I think when we can understand and the weight and the gravity of that, I think that can be really, really helpful in that context. Now, what about somebody who is like, yeah, I don't really talk to my senior leadership. I just kind of do my own thing. It's kind of worked out well where like they don't really bother me. I don't really bother them. You know, maybe somebody's in a scenario like that, and maybe youth group's going really well. They feel like things are going well. What would you say to that person to kind of maybe be like, yeah, this might seem like it's going well, but here's maybe the bigger picture.
Yeah. And when you were just talking about that before, it brought up another thought that I had where I was like early on in my time at McLean Bible where I currently serve. I was serving on a team, so I had like a youth ministry boss. So like we had, you know, a director, assistant director, and all that stuff. But then I was just wondering about some of the things that our senior leadership were deciding about our whole church, and I went to my boss and asked him like, "Hey, what is going on with these things, whatever?" And he said something very similar to what you just described. He's like, "Listen, there's things that they're carrying that would keep you up at night. Like, you know, it's just like the decisions that they have to be like the, you know, and so." So like, in other words, give them full benefit of the doubt, like that they're not just, you know, thinking about your one just area of ministry. And we have to realize, and this I had to come to terms too, is I am so passionate about youth ministry. I'm so passionate about teenage evangelism. Not everybody else is.
Yeah.
And so I'm like, you're wrong if you're not passionate about this too. Like, this is a, you know, and so give them the benefit of the doubt that they have their own passion, like they have their own, you know, larger picture focus of making decisions, you know, about the health of the church and that we don't always see. You know, there's things that they do that we don't always see, and they're carrying a load too. And so so I would say give them the benefit of the doubt with that. But that did remind me of early on where I was like, and he's like, listen, you don't even want those decisions to have to make, you know, because you're being held responsible by the Lord. So enjoy that time that you're not in those positions of making major decisions. I told that story. Now I forgot the question that she asked me. What was
somebody who's like, I'm fine. I'm doing my own thing. It's working.
So with that, like, you know, try to avoid that ships passing in the night, you know, because you guys are still, you know, on a church staff. Like, you're still serving at a church. And so I would say try to unify, but like, you know, set up regular times and you know, to just check in. So in other words, like don't say like, oh, I need you to like tell me more about what to do and like be more involved, you know, because some leadership approaches and understanding those different styles. And there's been conversations where I have. So my current boss of the church now is, you know, he was a Navy SEAL, and so his definition of like trust is like, I'm not going to check in, like, because like I just trust you to do it. Similar like what you're experiencing too, and so, but I went to him. I was like, I kind of need you to ask, like, how things are going, and like, so I can share, you know, like I need a little bit more like insight over that, and so, and just to like glean leadership principles and like, you know, and learn from you too. And so he's like, okay, let's at least get one meeting a month on the book so that we can check in and share different things. And so that was just communication I had to have, and understanding his leadership style, understanding my leadership style, where it's like, okay, I can run with things on my own, but I still need, you know, the kind of like directional check-in occasionally to make sure everything is going well with how it fits into the larger vision of the church. So yeah, I would just say avoid that ships passing in the night like mentality of, okay, you're fine, I'm fine, let's just do our own thing, because ultimately, like, you want it to be feeding into the larger vision of the church and the success of the whole church. Because there'll be a day, if you haven't been at your church long enough, you may not experience this as much, but if there'll be a day where your students will go into the adult portion of your church, you know, so you want to make sure that they're being included and that they're not experiencing a totally different church. And so you don't want to have a church within inside of a church to where they graduate out of your student ministry and then it's like, this isn't the church I go to. Like, you know, And so we want to do them a service to help them adjust well to the larger congregation.
And I think the other big part of it is understanding that you don't work in a vacuum. Like youth group happens in a vacuum, but those families, if they're at your church, like they're in the church. That it's not in a vacuum. So you can run a really great program and work with the kids really well, but each kid has a parent who cares for them and needs direction, needs help. They might have younger siblings that are involved in the church that maybe they're struggling, or older siblings maybe have aged out of youth ministry. So I think of like the families that the kids who've shared stuff going on with their families with us. And it's like, especially the stuff where we have to mandatory report. I couldn't imagine not having a relationship with senior leadership to where it's like, hey, you need to be made aware of something and they need to get involved. Like, you need to have such a great relationship, because that is so hard to walk through a lot of this, hey, our husband just walked out on the family. Like, you need to be able to have great relationships with people who can then pour into the parents and the mom and kind of be like, hey, you got the kids? Yep. Okay. I got them. Yep. And now you're ministering to the whole family, because what a shame for you to know about this, but then that creates kind of that hurt where the parents are kind of expecting, well, the church is going to reach out, but if you're not communicating. So I think it can do a lot of damage if we're just kind of, well, I'll do my own thing and kids ministry is doing their own thing. It's kind of like the American family right now, where it's like, well, Johnny has his, soccer practice 8 times a week, and because he's got private training, and Susie, she's in all AP classes, she has all this stuff, but everybody's doing great. We're just kind of doing our own thing, and we're kind of, and it's like, that's not the way things were designed to be. Like, we really need to be coming together and supporting, each other on that. So that would be something that I would add to that. Now, summarize for us simple steps. Okay, maybe your relationship with senior leadership isn't great. Maybe it's great, but it can always grow. Maybe somebody's getting ready to step into a position. 3 simple things. Hey, these are the first things. Check. Make sure you're doing these 3 things. Kind of takeaway points for somebody.
Yep. Yeah. So I would say 3 things is give them the benefit of the doubt. They're carrying their own stuff, personal and like larger, bigger stuff that has to do with the church. So give them the benefit of the doubt that they're not, if you feel like you're being overlooked or like that you're not being supported in some way, like, just know that they've got a lot on their plate, most likely too. And so give them the doubt, over communicate. So in other words, like I would say err on the side of over communicating as far as like, relational, problems that you're having or, conflicts that you're having, like, make sure that they're in the know, and then, clearly define expectations. So you have, a job description, or, just even if you have to do that for them. In other words, like, hey, these are the things that I feel like I'm responsible for within the youth ministry. Is there anything that you guys would do, or like, to protect? But yeah, and clearly set expectations when it comes to that. So yeah, so those are the 3 things that I would recommend is, give them the benefit of the doubt, set clear expectations, and over communicate when it comes to your needs and the things that they need to support you in.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, that's all we have time for the day. All we have time for today. Hopefully, there's some real takeaways that people can put into action to share with senior leadership as we continue to grow beyond the youth room. We're on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts. We're also on Facebook, TikTok, Instagram. Anything else? We haven't started Twitch game streaming yet, but that might come soon. But make sure to go ahead, like, follow, and share. We ask for nothing out of this.
We don't have anything to sell you.
No.
It's like we were just talking about this before. It's like, we want to make sure it's like this is all free content for you guys to use and grow.
Yep, and the training as well. We want nothing more than just the gospel to go forward. So we just encourage you to share this if this has been helpful with somebody. Maybe this particular episode has brought somebody to mind. We just ask you to share and just continue to help us grow this, just so we can continue to support and create an environment supporting youth pastors, youth leaders, and youth workers. So thanks so much for joining in, and we'll see you all next time.